Hi, sister.
Hi, Philip.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I am doing well. Thanks for joining me on Meaning of Life.
Sure. Happy to be here.
Yeah, let me introduce us. I am Philip Menchaca, and this is Meaning of Life TV, available as an audio and video podcast. And you are Sister Theresa Aletheia Noble, a professed religious sister with the Daughters of St. Paul, and the author of the book The Prodigal You Love, Inviting Loved Ones Back to the Church. And I wanted to talk to you today about faith and atheism, and I think we'll probably get into the problem of suffering, or the problem of evil, as it's sometimes called. And I'm particularly interested in your perspective because, like you, I believe I was raised Catholic, and like you, at one point I became an atheist, and in fact, I still am, but you clearly have returned to the church.
Yes.
So to start, I just want to talk about your religious upbringing and what that was like. Was your family highly observant?
They were. We were very, very Catholic. My dad has a PhD in theology, and so he worked for a Catholic university for a while, and then he worked for a diocese, and then he taught at secular colleges and community colleges. And my mother stayed home for a lot of my childhood, and she really brought the liturgy of the church into the house. We just, whatever was happening in church was happening in our house. We knew when Advent was, we knew when Lent was, and we knew when the saint feast days were. And so, yeah, they were very, very faithful.
And were you always on board with that? Were you very faithful as a kid?
My mom tells this story and I don't remember it, but she says when I was younger, I was watching this TV show about the gospel story, and it was at the point of the crucifixion, and I was probably, I'm guessing I was probably like 4 or 5, and Jesus was being crucified and the characters were crying, and she said I went up to the TV and I hugged the TV and I said, "Don't cry. It's because Jesus is dying for us. He's saving us. So this is a good thing." So I did have a strong faith. My dad, he did an evangelism course, so he would actually, this was very unusual for Catholics at the time,
Yeah.
but he would actually go door to door knocking on people's doors and talking to them about Jesus. So I would always want to go with him. I was really excited about that. But at the same time, I was into my faith, and I had a relationship with God that I would say was pretty strong. But I also was a very skeptical child from the very beginning. Like I remember the first time I had doubts that God existed, and I was 5 at the time. And I remember, like, the moment is kind of emblazoned in my mind. I was just walking up the stairs, and all of a sudden the thought occurred to me, what if God doesn't exist? And so, to have that at 5 years old, I really couldn't cope with the implications of it at the time.
Yeah.
It just kind of crumbled my world for a second, and then I just put it back together and was like, I'm just not going to think about that.
Just keep going.
Yeah, exactly. I can't handle that right now. But I was that kind of kid. I was always asking questions. My dad was a theologian, so he was very educated and able to answer a lot of my questions, but I often was not satisfied with them. A big one that I always had was when Moses comes to, first of all, he's in the desert with these whining people for 40 years. He gets to the end of this long journey, and God tells him to hit this rock because the people don't have water. And he tells him to hit it, I think, 3 times, and he hits it one too many times because he's really getting annoyed with these whining people. Can you understand? 40 years. And so God says, you hit it too many times, you're not going into the promised land. And I remember fighting with my dad about that. Just, if God is like that, I don't believe in him. it was so upsetting to me, that story. So, and that was, that was me all the time. I was always arguing about everything and pushing back on everything. There was always a tension for me.
Yeah. I mean, I've certainly had similar feelings about stories in the Bible where there are stories. I mean, Job, of course, is one of the classic ones, and why would God inflict such suffering on him? And have you ever resolved that in your mind? Some of these questions.
Yeah, there are still things that I struggle with, even after I came back to the church. I think I started going to Mass pretty regularly after I came back to the church, and one of the first stories is, and I'm forgetting her name, but her father promises God, if I win this battle, I'll sacrifice to you the first person I see when I come back from the battle. And he wins the battle, and his daughter comes out of the house, and he sacrifices her. And so this is at daily Mass, and the priest, well, it was the first reading, so that was read, and then the gospel, and the priest didn't say a word about it. And afterwards, he came out. It was hilarious because I waited for him, like you're waiting for a rock star to like exit the concert, and he comes out, and I'm like, Father, how could you not talk about that? Why? Like, how could that be okay? And he gave me a really unsatisfactory answer. And I remember walking away from that interaction feeling like so frustrated. It was like my childhood all over again. But it is different. And I think it's only different through my more mature relationship with God. Not that I understand everything, but it's not as much of a struggle for me as it was when I was a child.
Yeah. So, I mean, can you give an example? I mean, it might be kind of difficult to put into words, but what do you mean by a more mature relationship with God? I mean, how does that manifest? Well, I mean, you are a sister, so I suppose that is one way it manifests.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a phrase that's always sort of puzzled me, because I have never felt, I would go to church when I was a kid. We weren't a especially religious family, but I'd go every Sunday for until probably I was 12 or 13 when we started going less and less. But I've never felt that sort of relationship with God. So I hear people of faith often talk about having a relationship with God, and to me, I just don't quite understand what that means.
Yeah. I guess the best way to describe it is, when I was an atheist, I struggled with spirituality and what I believed in, and I wanted to be an educated atheist, so I started to study other religions. I figured I knew enough about Christianity. I was a little arrogant, so I started to study Buddhism and other different things, and I kind of started to make an intellectual journey towards believing in God while I was an atheist. And there were different steps in that journey that moved me. But I also had a conversion experience. As that journey went along, it kind of culminated in a conversion experience. And that conversion experience was not an intellectual movement towards believing in the existence of God, because I kind of made steps as far as I could. But the conversion experience was in meeting a person and knowing that because I kind of entertained this idea that there's this universal kind of force in the world, or kind of this quasi spirituality, but it wasn't really. I didn't believe in a personal God, but in this conversion experience, it wasn't my intellect kind of achieving something. It was being introduced to a person. And so, just like Paul on the road to Damascus falls down, he meets Jesus Christ, and bam, his life is different. It was the same for me. Like I knew a person, and so I started to relate to that person and dialogue with that person, and pray, throughout the day, just having conversations. It's like a friend, and that relationship but it's not a friend. It's not like another human being. It
Right.
is being itself. And, it's kind of amazing that being itself would come to me and kind of be in relationship with me. But it's kind of a sublime thing. But it kind of puts everything in perspective, because the things that I don't understand, I can understand it in terms of my trust in this being.
There's that relationship of trust that makes it possible to have faith despite doubts, occasional
Yeah.
doubts.
I think Kierkegaard describes it in Fear and Trembling. Abraham certainly had doubts and certainly did not understand what God was commanding him to do. But the fact that he trusted in a person was what allowed him to do what he did, to move forward, because he trusted in the power of this person more than in his confusion and his doubts.
So let's talk a little bit about your journey. And how old were you when you realized that you were an atheist, and how old were you when you announced you're an atheist, which may or may not be the same age, but I'm just curious.
So I was 14, and I remember the moment it was actually related to the problem of suffering. I was kind of mulling over that in my mind. I was driving. I wasn't driving, I was 14, but my parents were driving, and I was in the back of the car, and I was just thinking, my family was facing a lot of suffering at the time. And I remember thinking, I couldn't understand a God who would allow my family to suffer like this, especially when my family was trying so hard to serve him. And so it was really the problem of suffering, but also because my father worked so closely with the church, I kind of saw the underbelly of it, and I saw people behaving hypocritically, people being very uncharitable, people being much worse than uncharitable, just, really nasty things. And I remember thinking to myself, it's very important to me to be a good and virtuous person. These people have basically devoted their lives to the church, and they are not that. And so I think I can do this on my own. I think I can do a better job on my own, basically. So those were kind of some of the things that were going on that kind of pushed me into atheism. And I'm the kind of person that I don't hide what's going on in my head. So my parents knew right away. I said, and also at the time I was supposed to be confirmed, and so my parents said, were pushing me, and I said, I don't believe in God. How can I be confirmed if I don't believe in God? So it was pretty much bam, bam.
Yeah. How did they react?
They were devastated but I think they also realized that it wasn't something that they could control. And I also said to them, I'll still go to mass. I'll still, do whatever you want me to do, because I'm under your roof. But I just want to be clear with you. Like, I don't believe in God, and I'm not going to be confirmed. And so, yeah, they struggled with it. But I think they also maybe thought that it was going to be a a little bit less of a phase than it ended up being. So I think they were hoping, oh, this will be over pretty soon. And then it wasn't over. And then I think they started to get concerned.
How long did your atheism persist?
I was away from the church for about 12 years, and I was an atheist for most of that time.
Okay.
Yeah.
So at some point, did you start being a seeker, as they are called, someone who is searching out for different kinds of spiritualities, exploring?
Yeah, and I can't really say exactly when that started, right. and it's hard to say when you're, because for most of the time I still didn't believe in God. I had a thought that maybe there was something beyond the material, but I didn't believe in God until my conversion experience. So it's hard to say when people ask how long exactly were you an atheist. Right. I don't know.
It's kind of a strange question in a way, because that's not really how beliefs or intellectual thinking works. Usually there's not one moment. Conversion experiences might, that's an exception, I suppose.
Right, yeah. So yeah, I did in college. I basically was interested in being an informed atheist. I wouldn't have called myself a seeker, but I did go see a Buddhist monk speak once, and I remember being intrigued by his idea that desire is the source of suffering. And I remember being intrigued by his way of life. And so different things kind of intrigued me, but it wasn't enough for me to say that I was even a seeker or spiritual. When I left college, I was teaching in the inner city in Miami, and I was in Teach for America.
And I was too.
Were you?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Where were you?
I was in New York.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So, as you know, Teach for America is very hard.
It is a unique experience.
Yeah, man.
It is
wow,
extremely
I
difficult.
Survived it, though. Barely. But, yeah, so, and it was the first year that TFA was in Miami.
Oh,
so
wow.
That was like another difficulty on top of difficulties.
Yeah.
And so I was struggling a lot. So I remember, and as a teacher, I was in a situation where I had to be a better person than I was. Like my kids, I taught third grade, and my kids came from all kinds of different backgrounds that made them kind of need more than a teacher from me. They needed a lot more attention and patience and love, and I didn't have it,
Yeah.
I just lost my patience all the time. I remember thinking, I need to be a better person, and I want to be a good person. I want to be who these kids need me to be, but I don't have it in me. Like I need to do some work on me. And so I started to meditate, and I started going to Quaker meetings every week. My college had been Quaker, so I kind of gotten introduced to that through my college. I still didn't believe in God, and honestly, quite a few of the people at the meeting probably didn't either, but it was kind of a time where I could just be in silence, and it was non-dogmatic, and nobody was trying to convert me, but it was just a quiet time. And so I would say that I started to kind of move towards the seeker during that time, because I started to realize on my whole quest to be a good person, I just don't have the resources within me to do it, to face these challenges without some kind of guidance. So I think that's what led me to start seeking.
Yeah. So when was your conversion experience? Was it after you had finished Teach for America? So Teach for America is 2 years, and then...
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So then I moved to California. My boyfriend at the time was going to school there and getting his PhD. And so I was taking time off before I went to law school. And so I applied to law schools, and I started to travel. I went to Costa Rica, and I was in this little rural town in Costa Rica. where the roads get flooded in the fall and you're just like totally stranded. And but it was called an environmental learning cooperative that was started by 2 Peace Corps volunteers in the middle of the town. And so I volunteered with them. Like, I worked in the kitchen, I would carry firewood, I would work in the garden, and I lived with a local family. And I remember being in this town and realizing that everyone there, except for all the Westerners that were kind of in this little enclave, believed in God. Like, they were very faithful people. And I remember thinking to myself, why? Why do they believe in God? That I'd been kind of out of that milieu for so long that it was kind of shocking to me. And so I started to run through all the answers, like, well, they're poor, and, it's the opium of the people, and they need that. They need that hope. Or they're uneducated. Most of them hadn't even gotten to high school. So, if they had the chance of the education that I did, then they probably wouldn't believe in God. And as I went through these answers in my head, I was thinking, wow, I sound like such a jerk. I was thinking, and also, I'm not giving these people the credit that they deserve, because as I got to know them and interact with them, I found that they were so grounded, that they had like such a rootedness in them and in their lives, and the way that they interacted with me just was really fascinating to me. And in my whole quest to be a good person, I was looking at them and thinking, they're good people. Like, how did they become good people? And so it was like these uneducated, poor people knew more about life than I did. They knew something that I didn't know. And so I remember one day I was gardening and I was weeding, and this guy came up to me. He was the town drunk, and he said, "Hey, Teresita," he's like, "isn't it a beautiful day? Like, thank God for this beautiful day." And I looked up at him, and I'm very like straightforward. I was like, "Chepo, it's a beautiful day, but I don't have anybody to thank for it because I don't believe in God."
Oh, wow.
And I remember he looked at me like kind of astounded. I think mostly because he just probably never heard that before from anybody.
Right.
I mean, he knew the other Westerners, and they probably thought the same thing, but they probably never told it to his face. But he didn't look upset at me at all. He just looked kind of slightly amused. And as I looked into his eyes, I felt like I was looking at like some kind of primordial being. I was just like, there was this wisdom in the town drunk's eyes that I didn't have. I was like, well, how does he have this wisdom? And how does he know something that I don't know? And he didn't really say anything to me. He just said, okay, and that was the end of the conversation. But there was something in his eyes that kind of moved me. So the people moved me. And I think that kind of prepared my heart for my conversion. And my conversion happened. I was walking to the farm one day, and it was really early in the morning. And it's Costa Rica, so it's gorgeous and beautiful, and the mountains were around me, and it was kind of like what Chepo had said to me, it's a beautiful day, aren't you thankful? And I felt this feeling of gratitude in my heart for the beauty. And at the same time, there was this huge gust of wind, and I felt like one of the trees is going to fall on me. I kind of felt afraid. And so I felt this mixture of fear and gratitude at the same time. And in that moment, God introduced himself to me, and I knew that God existed, and that God wasn't just some impersonal force, but it was a personal God, and that he loved me, and that he had a plan for my life. And so after that, it was, I'm kind of a person of extremes. So I was on the plane ride home, and I was like, all right, I know God exists, and he has a plan for my life. And I got into law school, and that's my plan. That's not God's plan. I'm not going to go to law school. and have a boyfriend who I was probably going to marry. I'd been with him for 5 years, but that's my plan. That's not God's plan. So I broke up with him when I got off the plane. I mean,
Wow.
that's really extreme. So, yeah. But that's what happens when you, like, it's not just an intellectual movement. It's a meeting a person, meeting like a personality, like a personal God who I was in a relationship with, who I couldn't turn my back on it.
Yeah.
Like I can turn my back on an idea, but I can't turn my back on a personal God.
So when did you decide to become a religious sister?
So I didn't immediately go back to the church. I was, in fact, I was really uninterested in becoming Catholic. But I kind of slowly made my way back to the church, and that was only through my relationship with God. I'd chat with him every day, and I felt like that's where he was moving me. I would meet different people, and they would like talk to me about the local church, or there was just different things that kind of moved me in that direction.
Why were you not interested in going back to the Catholic Church?
I kind of felt like I've been there, done that. I also wasn't totally sold on Jesus. I believed in God, but I wasn't totally sure I was Christian. At that point, it was just, I know God exists, and that's it. That's all I really know right now. So it was hard to kind of figure out where I was going to go. But now it wasn't like just an intellectual journey. It was a journey with God. So I probably ended up coming to the Catholic Church much faster than I would have if I had thought about it a lot. Because even after joining, I still had many things I disagreed with. I intellectually, it didn't make sense to me. Now it does a lot more, but at first it was very confusing to me that God would lead me back to the Catholic Church. But I think a big part of it was also the Eucharist. I had a sense of God's presence in the Eucharist, and I think that helped me to believe that God was present in the church. So,
yeah. So what is the process for becoming, well, I was going to say nun, but I guess technically nuns are cloistered, right?
Yeah.
But what does that process look like?
Basically, you go through a time of discernment, and so after I came back to the church, I felt God calling me to think about religious life, and again, I was like, no way. Like, you can forget about it. I love you, but I don't love you that much.
I am not doing that.
Yeah, that was my first response, and probably my response for several years. But once you discern, you can go visit different orders, and there's thousands. It's really kind of overwhelming. There are a lot of religious orders around the country. I was in the Bay Area at the time, so I visited a few orders in that area, and I ended up finding out about the Daughters of St. Paul online, which is appropriate because they try to spread the word of God through modern media. So I was watching a YouTube video, and someone mentioned them, and I was like, oh. So I ended up visiting them, and so really you feel a call, and then you have to kind of discern, amidst that call, which order do I feel called to? What kind of, we call it a charism of the Holy Spirit, like which charism do I feel called to? What kind of work in the church do I feel called to? And then you apply, and they're checking you out just as much as you're checking them out, just to make sure that it's a good fit, that you're doing it for the right reasons. It's very important that there's a lot of freedom in this decision, because it's not something that you want to feel like like your mom kind of pushed you in, or whatever, or even a lack of freedom within yourself, feeling like God's calling you but you can't say no, and that kind of thing. So
yeah.
And once you're in, it's 2 years of, well, for our order it varies, but 2 years of novitiate, 2 years of postulancy, 5 years of temporary vows, which I'm in temporary vows, which that means that I take my vows a year at a time. So I take a vow of chastity, poverty, and obedience for this year, and then I do it for the next year.
Okay.
And then after 5 years, I do it for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
So,
So going back to the problem of suffering, how do you deal with that now? Do you still struggle with that?
Yeah. Every year we have a 1 week silent retreat, and during that retreat it's silent the entire time except for a meeting with your director and mass and prayer. And I can say every single year I struggle with the problem of suffering.
It's a problem. It is,
Yeah. It's kind of the way my retreat begins every year. I'm like wrestling with it with God. And 1 year a family friend's 3-year-old drowned in their pool. And that's how I began my retreat, was just like, God, why? How could you allow that to happen? You're all powerful. So definitely I still struggle with it. I guess the difference is that, not that I have all the answers. I don't think there's any intellectual answer that's completely satisfying.
Right.
But I wrestle with it with God. I think one thing that I've come to is that God sees things differently than we do. And one of the major things he sees differently is death, which is something that I've been meditating on a lot lately, especially. And so meditating on death and the Christian view of death has helped me to see the problem of suffering a little bit differently.
Yeah, that's something that I want to talk to you about, because I know that you're a proponent of memento mori. Anyone who follows you on Twitter will know this.
Yep.
So I guess first we should just explain what memento mori is.
Yeah. So it's an ancient tradition in the church. I mean, it had its heyday in medieval times. Memento mori is the Latin phrase that means remember that you will die, or remember your death. But it has its roots in scripture and in the church, in the early church. In Sirach, chapter 7, verse 38, it says, "And whatever you do, remember your last days, and you will never sin." There are several psalms that mention thinking about eternity, and so it's really a practice that's rooted in scripture. Saint Benedict, his 47th rule is to have daily your death before you. So it's really something that, but also Stoic philosophers.
Yes.
A lot of Stoics are into memento mori. It's very interesting. There's kind of a secular group of people who are into memento mori, and the nun.
we have someone who contributes to the site, Massimo Pigliucci, or Pigliucci, I think who is one of the leaders in the Stoic movement, and so.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah. Yeah. So it's it's an idea that anyone can really practice. To meditate on your death, and to kind of put your life in the perspective of your death every single day. And so the way that I've done that is, I can show you the skull on my desk. It's kind of little small skull, is to have a skull on my desk. And so every day I look at that skull and I just think, okay, my day in the perspective of my death, and I have no idea when that's going to be, because very often we like to think very idealistically about our death, like, oh, I'm going to die in old age, I'm going to be 100, but we never know when we're going to die. It could be tomorrow. It could be in a couple minutes. We have no idea when we're going to die. So putting life in that perspective just changes everything. I mean, it can there are a few responses to that, putting it into that perspective. You could say, oh, you only live once, so let's just do whatever. There's that.
The hedonist response.
Yeah, exactly. But the Christian response, and I think, I think the Stoic response too, would be I want to live my life in the best way possible, because I don't know when my death will be. And so instead of kind of wasting my day and my time thinking that my life is or my death is far in the future, I'm gonna live well, try to live well every minute. And that's a real discipline. I mean, ever since I started this practice, it's really become apparent to me how much time I waste, and just how many things I do that if I really was going to die tomorrow, I'm not so sure I'd be doing.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it has a long history. Meditating on death has, I think, a long history in various religions. I know in Buddhism, for instance, there are certain meditations where you meditate on death and the body and
the body rotting.
The body rotting. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So you've actually done Buddhist meditation, is that right? You said you were interested in Buddhism.
I was, and I did meditation, but I don't know, I did my Western kind of curious Western girl interested in Buddhism kind of form of meditation. And that form of meditation I found very difficult. And I don't know if I was doing it wrong. It's very possible.
I feel like everyone feels like they're doing it wrong when they start.
Yeah, maybe. That's what everyone kept telling me is, well, everyone feels like they're doing it wrong. But I think I was really, really pretty bad at it. I mean, I'd always fall asleep. I'd kind of be sitting next to my bed early in the morning, and I'd find myself like on the floor, like totally falling asleep. So I was pretty awful. But and the whole idea of kind of letting your thoughts float by. I just couldn't do that. It was a huge struggle for me. So prayer, the Christian form of prayer, and we do have what is called meditation, where, but for us, meditation is like meditating on the Gospels, actually kind of chewing on it. You're actually like thinking about it.
Like an intellectual experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Like in the process of Lectio, of reading scripture, like the first part is kind of intellectual, and the meditatio is, it's kind of chewing on it, but it's also entering into it, and you're kind of praying with it, but you can enter the scene, and so it can be kind of imaginative too. But then the part where your thoughts, where I guess it would be a little bit more similar, is contemplation, but you're not trying to control it. You just allow whatever is happening to happen. So I think that's what makes it easier for me, because I feel like I'm in a dialogue with someone. I'm not just kind of by myself. And so I'm dialoguing, and then it goes to silence. And that silence just is natural. It's almost like, when you're with someone you love, and you just stop talking, and it's silent for a little while. And it's just perfect. It's just like more beautiful than when you were talking, but you're still kind of communicating. So I think for me, that silence is different, because I'm still communicating with someone.
So do you think that having gone through a loss of faith and then returned to the church makes it easier for you to communicate with people who are atheist or agnostic or struggling with faith?
I hope so.
Yeah. And that was a subject of your book, correct?
Yeah. So I wrote a book called The Prodigal You Love, Inviting Loved Ones Back to the Church. And the reason I wrote it was because our sisters run bookstores. And so when I entered the convent, I was working in these bookstores, and any priest or nun will tell you that a big prayer request that we receive is pray for my son or daughter who is away from the church, which is natural because a lot of people are leaving the church. So oftentimes I would kind of share my story with people, or or I'd try to give them a little bit of advice if I felt like they needed it. And in some cases, one lady told me, I tell my son he's going to go to hell every single time I see him. And I was looking at her to see if there was any sort of like self-awareness in that, and there wasn't. She thought I would approve of this. So I remember thinking, there might be some people out there who are really struggling with this and struggling with how to, like, some people of faith just don't understand what it's like to doubt. They don't understand what it's like to feel skeptical. And and you have to understand that. The thing is, the woman I entered the convent in with, she said one time to me, I don't think I've ever doubted that God existed. And I looked at her and I said, you haven't thought about it enough. Like, I mean, people of faith who say that they don't have doubts just haven't thought about it enough. And so, it's one of the things I talk about in my book is if you're a person of faith and you're trying to invite people back to the church, you have to get in touch with your doubts. You have to wrestle with them. You have to understand what the other person is going through so that you can relate to them in a way that doesn't come across as patronizing and arrogant.
Yeah. Well, we should probably wrap up, but this has really been a delightful conversation. And I just have one last question just to satisfy my curiosity. Okay. Your name, Aletheia, that's Greek for truth? Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's my religious name. So when we take our vows for the first time, we choose a religious name. And I had been thinking about veritas, the Latin word for truth. Right. But I wanted truth because that, first of all, the Daughters of St. Paul have a devotion to Jesus, way, truth, and life. But for me, I felt like I had been seeking truth my whole life. Like I was thirsty for it my whole life. I've always been fighting to understand and to grasp the truth. And what I've realized is that the truth is a person. And so, and while I was pursuing that truth is pursuing me. So that's why I chose that name.
And that also, I suppose, explains your Twitter handle.
Yeah.
It's pursued by truth, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And is there any other place that people can find information about the Daughters of St. Paul or anything that you write?
Yeah, our website is pauline.org, and I write for aletheia.org, which is appropriate, but it's spelled a little bit differently. It's Aletheia. Aletheia.
Okay.
No. Aletheia. There we go. So, yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to talk with me. I greatly enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
All right, take care.